Muy buenas noches. Welcome to Rice and to tonight's forum on the office of the Secretary of Treasury of the United States. In the wake of the events of September the 11th, many hark back to the wisdom of our nation's founders. They established, you may remember, only 3 executive departments to begin with: War Department, Foreign Affairs, and Treasury. That was to secure the new nation. The Treasury's history shows that their confidence was very well placed. Let me give you just 2 examples to offer just a bit of historical perspective. There once was a much more auspicious September the 11th, and that was in 1789 when Alexander Hamilton became the first Treasury Secretary. He established, among other things, the Revenue Marine, today's Coast Guard, and helped create the United States Navy. Did you know that? In 5 years, Hamilton helped transform a nation with large debts and little money into a credit-worthy nation with a stable national currency and enjoying financial stability. And in this century, the 52nd Treasury Secretary, Henry Morgenthau, Jr., made the dollar the world's strongest currency and financed World War II by raising more revenue than all previous secretaries combined. And now we've benefited, we have a history now that gives us 72 U.S. Treasury Secretaries. It is a considerable feat that the Baker Institute tonight has assembled 8 of those. 9 would have made it but for Larry's inconvenience at his day job at Harvard, and he was unable to make it. Thank you very much for coming, Terry's, for coming.
And Mr. Donaldson.
Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Mr. Stephen Kotler, Chairman of the Wilson Council, who is representing the Honorable Lee Hamilton, the Director of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Stephen.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. On behalf of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, I want to join the Ambassador and President Gillis in welcoming you to this conference on the role of the Secretaries of the Treasury. As America responds to the tragic attacks of September 11th, we have all been reminded of the critical role the Treasury Secretary plays in supporting national security as well as the national economy. As America has become more deeply involved with the global economy, the Secretary and important elements of the Treasury have also taken on a critical global role. The Woodrow Wilson Center is very pleased to have joined with the Baker Institute in sponsoring today's conference. Established in 1968 as a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, the center's mission is to bring together the thinkers and the doers, the scholars and the policymakers, the academics and the business practitioners. Like Wilson, Secretaries of the Treasury often combine institutional leadership, policymaking, and an active appreciation for the world of ideas. Today's conference is the 3rd joint conference sponsored by the Baker Institute and the Wilson Center. At the Wilson Center in Washington, we have already held conferences gathering White House chiefs of staff and national security advisors. We look forward to further joint efforts. This conference fits nicely with the Wilson Center's commitment to promote a better understanding of issues so that better policy will emerge. As we enter the 21st century, the Center is focused on exploring the long-term challenges facing the United States and asking what role the United States should play in the world. When I look at the combination of talent, accomplishment, and commitment to public service represented by the Secretaries of Treasury here today, I cannot but think back to the time when President Kennedy gathered his cabinet for a White House meeting. Kennedy commented on the talent around him and suggested the White House had never seen it like, except possibly when Thomas Jefferson dined alone. I have to say that our gathering of secretaries will meet and even exceed the Jefferson test. It is a pleasure and a privilege to represent the Center in such august company. I am very much looking forward to an education on government, politics, and economic policy. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have two prominent and distinguished moderators for this evening's program. The first panel will be moderated by Sam Donaldson of ABC News, and the second by Paul Gigot of the Wall Street Journal. Toward the end of each panel, the moderators will take questions from the floor. We will take a 5-minute break. We had a longer one, but given the time delay in between the panels, first break will be at 6:55. Please ask you to be back in your seats by 7 o'clock. During the break, I kindly ask the audience to allow the photographer to take an official photo of the panel participants, so please keep this area in front of the dais clear at that time. It is now, well, the program will conclude, and it is being at 8 p.m. and is being televised, including on C-SPAN. It is now my personal pleasure to introduce Mr. Sam Donaldson, who will in turn introduce our distinguished panelists. You have Sam's illustrious biography in your program notes, and I will not repeat everything. Want to note that Sam Donaldson was born in Texas, which and I forgive him for the other item in his bio, because he's covered every national political convention since 1964, with the exception of the 1992 Republican Convention in Houston. But since he's a Texan, we'll forgive you for that. But Sam Donaldson, 33-year ABC News veteran. He served 2 appointments as chief White House correspondent for ABC News. He's the host of the Sam Donaldson at abcnews.com live internet newscast. He's co-anchor with Diane Sawyer of Primetime Live. It goes on and on. He's received many awards, and including the Broadcaster of the Year award. Sam Donaldson is so well known, he's one of these people you really don't have to introduce, but I do have a personal anecdote. When George Shultz, the Honorable George Shultz, was Secretary of State, he called me to his office and he said, "Ed, President Reagan needs you at the White House. We're going to send you over there to be the deputy press spokesman for foreign affairs." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Really, but you could come home anytime. If it gets too tough over there, you can come home anytime." In fact, Don Regan was the chief of staff at the time at the White House. And I went on a Monday. I was put on the White House briefing room on a Thursday. And the first question I got asked was on Treasury bill policy. I knew nothing about Treasury bills or U.S. policy on Treasury bills. And so I did what everyone does at the State Department. I said, "No comment. I'll look into that. I have nothing for you on that." And then Sam popped up right in the front row, and he pointed his pencil at me. Television cameras were going. He said, "Look, Mr. whichever way you pronounce your name, but you may have been able to get away with this no comment stuff at that gentleman's club called the State Department, but you are at the White House now, and do you know what it means when you are standing there and saying you have no comment?" And I stupidly said, "No, what does it mean?" And he said, "That means you are saying that President Reagan is ignorant on this issue." I could have collapsed. I felt like calling George Shultz immediately and saying, "Take me back home," but I stuck it back out. Ladies and gentlemen, join me in welcoming Sam Donaldson.
Well, a good story, as you've just heard, is always made better with a little embroidery. Ambassador, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, in this first panel, we're going to talk about bureaucracies, politics, and personalities that revolve around the Secretary of the Treasury. I want to introduce these distinguished gentlemen, not in the order in which they're seated, but in the ascending order in which they served. George Shultz served President Nixon. He was the 62nd Treasury Secretary. He held 4 cabinet posts, president of the Bechtel Corporation at one time. He's won the Medal of Freedom, and as some of us know, he's so proud of one of his alma maters that he has tattooed on his skin the Princeton Tiger. At least that's what I've heard. Michael...
No confirm or deny.
No comment. Michael Blumenthal is the 64th Secretary of the Treasury, served President Carter. He, before that, had been Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Economic Affairs for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Headed such great corporations as Bendix, Burroughs, and Unisys. Also from Princeton, Do you want to confess?
I have nothing to confess.
All right, thank you. Nothing for you at this time. G. William Miller also served President Carter as the 65th Secretary of the Treasury. Before that, the Chairman of the Federal Reserve Board. He ran Textron Corporation at one time and is currently Chairman of the G. William Miller and Company Merchant Banking. Can you lend me some money?
Why not?
Why not? Man has not seen my credit statement, I'll see that. Donald Regan served President Reagan as the 66th Treasury Secretary. He also was the White House Chief of Staff. Before that, the Chairman and CEO of Merrill Lynch and Company. I think when you started, it was Merrill Lynch, Pierce, Fenner, and Bean?
When I started.
And then became Smith?
Right.
Never happened. I don't know what happened to those guys. In any event, he's a best-selling author, #1 at one point, and now his career is oil painting. And no, seriously, and a Regan may be worth something more than a Monet someday. But you have to die.
Worth more than money.
More than money. James A. Baker III, under whose roof we are privileged to sit, also served as President Reagan as the 67th Treasury Secretary, Secretary of State also, later White House Chief of Staff, won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, senior partner of Baker and Botts, also a firm in Washington called the Carlyle Group, is his senior advisor to, Princeton man and all of that. When they play from the halls of Moctezuma, along with others in this panel, he stands up. Nicholas Brady, the 68th Treasury Secretary, served President Bush. That's number 41, as you know. For a time, a senator from New Jersey, president and chairman of the board of Dillon Reed and Company, the great house for many, many years, now currently as chairman of Darby Overseas Investments. Lloyd Benson Jr. served President Clinton, the 69th Treasury Secretary. 3 terms in the House of Representatives, 3 terms in the United States Senate, ran for the vice presidency in 1988. We all remember the great line. But won the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and at this moment, I think we would need his expertise. In World War II, he was a bomber pilot, B-24s out of Italy, won a lot of medals for that. Robert Rubin served President Clinton, the 70th Treasury Secretary, before that Assistant to the President for Economic Policy, co-senior partner and co-chairman of Goldman Sachs and Company. Not an insignificant company. Very small company, but you helped it grow. And now, chairman of the Executive Committee, among many other titles, of Citigroup. And were you telling me that you are the biggest lender now?
I think you're not looking to borrow.
Well, I just got a loan from
You
Miller.
just got a loan, you're okay? I think we're a pretty good-sized creditor.
Pretty good-sized creditor.
But that's because we watch our credits carefully.
That's fine. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the panel. And let me just begin with a question. On the 11th of September, no one could have contemplated it, I suppose, prepared for it, but what would the Secretary of the Treasury have to do on that day? Secretary Schultz, what on that day, if you had been in the Treasury Department, would you have had to do, except mourn, of course?
Our current Secretary of Treasury had to figure out how to get back from Japan, which in a way is a marker of what a Secretary of the Treasury does. It's a job that has immense domestic responsibilities, but a tremendous interaction all over the world. And so Secretary O'Neill was traveling. But of course, when September 11th arrived, we had an economy already in trouble. And you could see immediately that the trouble would get more serious. And so the Secretary of the Treasury has to take a lead in helping the President formulate a program and get it in being. And that's exactly what Paul O'Neill did.
You're nodding your head, Secretary Rubin. I mean, with all the death and destruction, that has to be first thing. But how do you immediately say we've got to keep the economy from going in the dumper?
No, I'd agree with George. It seems to me what you do, I do think the economy was in considerable difficulty before September 11th, and I think I would say exactly what George did. You sit with the President and the other members of the economic team, and you try to determine what economic impacts this is likely to have and what changes you might want to have in your response. I think the other thing that you need to do is to figure out how to discuss the economy in the public domain in a way that, on the one hand, is serious and thoughtful, and on the other hand, provides reassurance.
Secretary Regan, what?
Well, in addition to what these other gentlemen have said, I think also the Secretary of the Treasury has to look after the money markets and after the stock market. After all, those are the two barometers that the world, as a matter of fact, is watching. What's happening to the dollar, what's happening to the stocks.
Would you have suggested they remain closed as long as they did?
Yes, very definitely. I think they needed the time not only physically, because their plant was wiped out or a lot of their communications gear was injured and not working, but also I think the world needed time to breathe, to think. And I think that's exactly what we should be doing more of today, slowing down a little bit and thinking this through rather than trying to race to a decision quickly.
What do you hear from other countries at that moment, when the United States suddenly is attacked in this fashion and the economic system is attacked? And what do you say to other countries?
The agenda for the Secretary on that day is a very big one. Some of them you've heard about. But you must remember that the Secretary of Treasury also has responsibility for the Secret Service. So the protection of life and property and protecting the president, protecting the important institutions of government, embassies, but at the same time, you are correct. You need to be in contact with a multiplicity of avenues to create confidence, stability. Obviously, the Treasury would normally release its desk officers to be in touch with their foreign counterparts to inform them what's going on, make sure they understood that the markets were going to be dealt with and that we were going to have a coordinated policy and that we were not in any sense in danger of any collapse. So there's a lot of confidence building as well as the direct importance of making sure that security is in place, not only with the Secret Service, with Customs, with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms. All of those things are of enormous importance at that time.
Secretary Brady, I take it you called the chairman of the Fed, if he hasn't called you immediately, to try to coordinate all this.
I think you put your finger on it, Sam. I think something that's enormously important is to assure liquidity in the system so that trades which were being conducted do settle on time. And I think the thing that scares people the most is when they don't get paid and they owe other people money because they're on the other side of the transaction. So I think you'd work with the Fed chairman and the Federal Reserve Board and New York Fed in New York to make sure that there's enough liquidity in the system to make sure that school keeps. And I think the figure is out now that the Fed did inject some $80 billion of liquidity into the system, which is an all-time record, more than 10 times that which had ever taken place before, and allowed the system to continue. It was a complete breakdown of telephone, telecommunications, and of course people. People who made trades weren't there anymore. And they existed and they had to be taken care of, and I think it's one of the remarkable performances that liquidity was maintained.
Secretary Blumenthal, it's tough having to follow everybody who said some of the things that you would say, but what would you add to what the Secretary of Treasury might want to do on that day?
Well, first of all, it occurs to me as I listen to all my colleagues, predecessors, and followers, that it illustrates the multiplicity of functions that a Secretary of the Treasury has and must perform. And on a day like this, to be specific, he has to remember that the psychological shock is not only great in this country, it's equally great around the world. And I suspect that this Secretary of the Treasury, as any one of us would have been, will have been on the telephone and on the computer and communication with his principal colleagues around the world, trying to make sure that the liquidity is maintained not only in this country but worldwide, and giving some reassurance to the system, the global system as a whole, that the United States is handling this problem and doing its job. That's a very, very important function, to give that kind of security to his colleagues around the world in Europe who were equally shocked and in a psychological state as we were in this country.
Secretary Baker, on a day like that, or a day of similar crisis, the President is busy with something else. Does the Secretary of the Treasury just do it on his own without a lot of time to confer with the Chief Executive?
Well, I think with respect to the Federal Reserve, he would do it on his own, and I think in this case, the Treasury was particularly fortunate in having Chairman of the Federal Reserve in Alan Greenspan, who
obviously himself recognized the problem and was quite prepared to inject massive liquidity. On other occasions that I'm aware of, there have been instances where the Treasury would be pushing for more liquidity and the Fed would be a little bit timid about injecting it. So I think he would pick up the phone and call. I think if I had been there, and of course Paul O'Neill was in Japan. I think one of the first calls you make is to the White House. The president, if he's there, he wasn't there. You talk to your contacts at the White House. But as Mike Blumenthal said, I think the question demonstrates the range of functions and responsibilities of the Treasury Secretary. You got to deal with your law enforcement function, so you would be talking to the White House on that and talking to your law enforcement agencies in Treasury. You would have to deal with the function you have of coordinating with the Federal Reserve and injecting liquidity. And then you would have to be very, very diligent, I think, in talking to your counterparts overseas to make certain, as Mike indicated, that they understand that the United States is going to be dealing with this in a rational, reasonable, and successful way.
You wanted to add something, Secretary Regan?
Since my day, the Secretary of the Treasury is now a member of the National Security Council. So as a result of that, you'd have to be available for whenever the President called a meeting of the National Security Council. So therefore, you'd have to meet with your advisors and be well briefed before you would ever attend that meeting in the White House. So one of the jobs of the Secretary would be to report to such a body what's going on in the money markets and in the economies of the country. What is the reverberations of all of this? What's happening, so that they know, because they're focusing on other things.
All right.
I'm sure the Secretary on that day had an emergency plan, so he didn't have to just invent all of this. And I suspect the Secretary, Paul O'Neill, being in wherever he would instantly set up a control room to coordinate all of this, because you can't have, there's so many agencies and you have to have a way to communicate, and yet one person can't do that. So you need a staff war room, so to speak, to deal with this, and I'm sure that was done.
Sam?
Yes.
I think we've left one thing out, which is important. Secretary of the Treasury traditionally is also the principal point of contact for the major CEOs of the large commercial banks, investment banks, and the major corporations of this country. On a day like this, he will receive calls from these people, or he will want to call them, partly in order to inform himself so that he can report properly, whether it's in the National Security Council or whatever, or make up his own mind as to what is happening out there, and partly to reassure them or to talk to them and to counsel with them. So that's another element. I think we are really covering a panorama of vast responsibilities, which on a day like that all have to be dealt with in some way or other.
Well, all of you have given a taste of this, and I think Paul Gigot and his panel will pick up more of what may be the reverberations in the financial markets from September 11th. Let's move on now to one of our topics, the bureaucracies. And I'm now going to start with the bureaucracy within an administration, and then we can widen it to Congress and every place else. The Treasury Secretary is traditionally the chief spokesperson for an administration. But as you gentlemen know far better than I do, the pressures within a White House on the economy are immense, and you don't always agree. So let's start, Bob Rubin, if I may, with you. In the Clinton White House, who were all the players? Did you always agree? And when you didn't agree, until the president made a final decision, how did it work?
Sam, I suspect, and you'll hear from the others, and we'll get a sense of it, that every White House is somewhat different. President Clinton had given enormous thought to this before he actually entered the Oval Office. As you know, he set up something called the National Economic Council. And basically what he did was to coordinate his economic policy, having all of the relevant cabinet agencies at the table, and there was a head of the National Economic Council. I was the first one, but my job was to coordinate. Our lead spokesman and lead person was obviously Lloyd Benson, who was the towering figure of that economic team. And if we didn't believe that, he would tell us that, so there was never any question about it. But it was really President Clinton had an enormous respect for what President Bush had done on the foreign policy side in terms of coordinating economic policy, and he said, I want to accomplish on the economic side what President Bush had done on the foreign policy side. So it really did function very much as a team, and then we would frame our issues, and the president would join us, and he would see where our differences lay, and then he would make his decisions.
Well, but President Clinton in the campaign made many promises in the terms of economic policy, which he later decided he wanted to change. In that change, clearly there must have been great debate.
Yeah, I actually would frame that a touch differently, if I may.
Please.
He had, as you said, during the campaign, made quite a number of what you'll call promises. I guess I would say that we had a program. But when he got into office, he found that the deficit that he inherited was very substantially larger than he'd expected, and so he did have to make choices he had not expected to have to make. And we had some very lengthy debates, first during the transition, and then during, as Lloyd will well remember, during the early days of the White House. And we framed these as decisions with respect to deficit reduction versus the various other programs that he had hoped to accomplish. And what he said at some point very early in the process was, the deficit is the threshold issue. If we don't deal with that, nothing else can get accomplished. And he made that central decision. That central decision, Sam, basically guided his economic policy for 8 years.
Secretary Blumenthal, pick up on this and see if you can give us more insight about the infighting that goes on. I mean, it's not a personal thing necessarily, or is it? Do we find personalities around the table beginning to argue for economic policies to some extent because they either like or don't like the guy on the other side?
I was afraid you'd turn to me next. I remember you used to stand out on the lawn and shout at me when I came out. What did he say?
That was my job.
Oh, that was your job. That's right. Well, obviously, following up on what Bob Rubin has said, it depends very much on the personality of the president. The president's the boss. And he is fundamentally the one who determines how he wishes to organize the White House and his government, his cabinet. It's his. And it's a reflection of the individual. I happened to work for a very fine man who had not given a lot of thought to how to organize economic policy making in the White House, and who had the view that he could master it pretty much by himself. He was a very diligent student. He would get up very early in the morning, at 5 o'clock in the morning, and he would study the brief, the economic brief, and he developed a certain veneer of knowledge. But he had not thought through how in this vast apparatus of the federal government you bring together the different opinions, the different strands, the different departments, and get out of that a coherent policy and how the whole thing fits together. And in that role, the function of a Secretary of the Treasury is a much more difficult and a very different one. Final point being, how much time have you spent, and I wonder how that applies to all my colleagues here, before you are appointed, discussing with the president-elect what he wants to do and seeing whether or not you're in agreement with him. And how well do you know the man? How well does he know you?
Well, please correct me if I'm wrong, but you and President Carter did not know each other much before he decided to appoint you.
At all. Well, I had supported him, and I had gone
yes, but
to
I mean, you
advise
hadn't
him
talked to him about economics?
We were not intimate, let's put it that way.
Whichever way you wish to put it, sir, is all right with me.
Well, and as I said, and he had very clear views, and I didn't share some of those views, and I found that it was very difficult to influence him. I have a bit the sense from watching and reading the papers now that we may be facing again a problem of this kind, a secretary who had occasionally views somewhat different from the boss, statements that were made during the campaign. And how do you bring that together? It's the personality of the two and of the team that has to somehow bring this together, or it doesn't work. And in our case, it didn't work very well, as you know.
Secretary Regan, talk to us about interacting with the boss, maybe having disagreements or not having disagreements, but also, in your case, very strong personality, used to running a company, and used to saying what you wanted to say.
I said it.
You did. Now, in discussing...
The fact that no one listened, Sam, including you, is beside the point.
In discussing economics with President Reagan, I mean, how did that work? And with other players in the Reagan administration?
Well, we tried to settle our differences in the Economic Affairs Council before they got to the president, so that at a point in time when we were all more or less on the same page, we would bring him in and say, we have reached this conclusion on such and such. What do you think? Or we'd give him a position paper through the chief of staff, who's sitting over to my right here, who would either give it to him or not, depending upon how he felt about our council.
That's called the gatekeeper function, and sometimes the gate gets shut.
And later that reversed itself when we swapped jobs. But seriously, I think that there should be within an administration various points of view, given the political atmosphere of Washington, on how to treat a certain subject. There is no, how will I put it, finite wisdom in economics. We do not know the rules that have to be kept. We have ideas about that. We have thoughts about that. We have theories about that. In Treasury, I tried to take a monetarist and a supply-sider so that I would get both points of view coming to me. I tried to reflect both of those to the president, who instinctively felt like a supply-sider, but didn't realize that he was also needed a monetarist in order to help him through this economic morass that he found himself in when he first came in and we were in a recession. So I think that differences of opinion between the White House and Treasury or among the president's economic advisors is a healthy thing, provided that they try to settle it and leave the decisions, the final decisions, to the president, and not do it, you'll pardon the expression, publicly with the media.
Let me fine-tune that by turning to Secretary Baker, who may, I'm certain, will not be reticent in correcting me if I have misstated the facts here. But there was a huge tax cut in the first year of the Reagan administration. You were chief of staff then, not Secretary of the Treasury.
Correct.
And you were working with Secretary Reagan. But in the second year of the administration, many people came to believe in the administration that it was too much. And you had to somehow convince the president to raise taxes. Now you can correct. How did you do that?
Not too successfully, when you consider that he has written in his book that he thinks it was probably the worst decision of his presidency.
But you helped him make it.
Well, that's right. We probably helped him make some good ones too, Don and I together. But in terms of the original question, Sam, let me say I think it's really important, picking up on what Bob Rubin said and what Mike said, to have a good personal relationship with the president. That's important regardless of the office, particularly important for Secretary of State, as George Shultz knows, but also really important for the Secretary of the Treasury. After Don Regan and I swapped jobs in 1985 and I became Treasury Secretary and he became Chief of Staff at the White House, the Treasury Secretary in both Reagan terms was always the chairman of the Economic Policy Council, the Economic Policy Board. We did not have a competing power center, if you will, in the White House. And I never detected any real problem whatsoever, given my background with President Reagan, having served him 4 years as his Chief of Staff, giving Don's background with him, having served him 4 years as Treasury Secretary. And before that switch happened, President Reagan had decided that his #1 domestic priority going into his second term was going to be fundamental tax reform. And so the Tax Reform Act of '86 was his #1 domestic objective and goal, something that we cooperated on. And we really didn't have the discord, I don't think, that you've seen in some other administrations and in some other areas other than economics.
Secretary, I'm just coming to you, Secretary Shultz, and I just want to predicate.
I'm going to give you my own introduction.
Well, please, sir, then. But then I'll come back with my question.
All right, on your question, I had 3 different experiences in how the setup would be. The first was when I became director of the Office of Management and Budget. And the president installed me in the White House rather than the traditional office. And the first thing that came up that was tense at all was the question of whether or not we should bail out the Penn Central, which was a big financial organization. And it dawned on me that my antagonist was not the Secretary of the Treasury. He didn't seem to be in the argument. The other side was Arthur Burns, the chairman of the Fed, who wanted to bail out, and I was arguing consistently down the years that it would be a mistake. But it was sharp to me that the Treasury Secretary wasn't there. And so you had this uneasy situation where the director of the budget was looked to by the president, but there was a secretary of the Treasury, and somehow it was not comfortable at all. And that is one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons why President Nixon reached out to the state of Texas and appointed John Connally as Secretary of the Treasury. And as all you Texans know, John's a take-charge guy. And as soon as he was there, he was dominant. For my taste, too dominant. That is, it was hard to find out what the program was, and you always were told, well, in the Treasury we're working at it. And before you knew it, he had the president sold on a program that turned out to be a catastrophe.
Wage and price controls?
Wage and price controls.
That was going to be my question.
And I fought and I lost, but the problem was the fight was too late. We didn't know what was up until too late. At any rate, John left the administration and I succeeded him as Secretary of the Treasury. And then President Nixon made me also assistant to the president for economic policy. And I had a little staff in the White House. And so the Secretary of the Treasury had a sort of legitimated role in the White House as well as in the Treasury for the coordination of economic policy. And I think on the whole that worked pretty well. And while it is a more formal arrangement than the one you described, it is very similar in many ways to, particularly since you came from the White House to the Treasury, and you told me once that you went to all the morning meetings in the White House and so forth, so you were in the White House as well as the Treasury. And I think to be effective as Secretary of the Treasury, you have to be there in the White House with the President and having his confidence.
Secretary Miller, we've heard from Secretary Blumenthal about the early problems in discussing economics with Jimmy Carter, who thought he knew his own mind and wanted to do it all. And when you inherited that post, we were going really well. You tell us, the gas lines were forming, the economy was headed for sky-high interest rates. Were you happy to be appointed?
I had a choice of keeping a 14-year-old job or getting out of office and going back to the private sector. I elected the easy way.
Tell us about the infighting, don't use my word infighting. Tell us about the discussion.
Well, first place, just a general comment. Everybody is consistent, I think, that each president is going to be different. Each president is a human being, has different objectives, different experiences, different. But in Michael Blumenthal's case, he ran the interference for me. And so I inherited a situation that perhaps hadn't been working smoothly, and perhaps I was given the go-ahead to restructure it. And so we very quickly set up an economic policy group, somewhat like others have had, and put only senior people from all the relevant departments. And very quickly it was possible to coordinate, to present to the president, and to he withdrew from the environment that Michael described, and instead I think that we operated much more on the line of some of the other administrations, where the economic policy group developed policies, tried to worked out the conflicts privately, and then presented a program to the president. And sometimes he agreed and sometimes he didn't, but when he agreed, we all then carried it out. I think ours, I don't recall any cases where we had conflicts based on personality, which you raised. We may have had conflicts based on difference of opinion, but nobody was saying, I'm going to do this or go around the back because I don't like that person, that he or she. Instead, I think there was a sense that everybody had a need to respond to the terrible conditions brought about by the fall of the Shah of Iran and the oil price shock of '78 that set off inflation and problems that we had to deal with in very difficult times. And I found that it was a sea change from what Mike experienced. It was a sea change that was brought about probably by the recognition that it needed to be changed.
Word there.
I think that raises one other very important element that needs to be mentioned. Timing is important. Timing is important not only in terms of the ability of the Secretary to do certain things, which he can do differently when the economy is moving forward than when it is moving into a recession or a very deep recession, as was the case as I was leaving and Bill was taking over. But it's also important in terms of what time is it in terms of the president's term. He was going into an election year. That's the 4th year of his presidency. He'd had 3 years of experience trying different things. So obviously he acts differently in an election year when his mind and his focus is on other things than he does in the 1st year of his presidency when he is trying to implement some of the things he's talked about during the campaign. So all of these things are important.
Don't forget, I came into office in August of '79, and on November 4, the hostages were taken in Tehran. So a lot of things changed, and a lot of need to operate differently came about. And the economic policy, I do believe that under those circumstances, the president delegated much more than he would have perhaps before. And therefore, it was much more in my court to carry the ball on that than it would have been with Chrysler, with the freezing of assets and all of that sort of thing that were very, very, very serious issues that we had to deal with under a great deal of stress.
Secretary Brady, tell us about the discussions in the Bush administration. You had a great bailout for the savings and loan industry. At the time you came in, you had no idea how many billions of dollars that would take. You had deficits still running, huge deficits. I don't want to get into a political argument here, but it was a matter of fact. You were faced with the president's promise not to raise taxes. Just walk us through some of the discussions that you and your colleagues had.
Yeah, Sam, let me back up just 1 second to say each of these presidencies is different. And in the case of the presidency of the first President Bush, I succeeded Jimmy Baker as Secretary of the Treasury in the middle of the summer during the campaign. So I didn't join the campaign trail, and we had the whole fall of 1988 to try and think about what the problems might be for that incoming administration. So we had a great study time in order to try and figure out what to do about the savings and loan, what to do about the banks, what to do about the budget. And so I was also lucky to have George Shultz still in the Secretary of State, so we formed kind of a study group which got a big jump on the incoming administration. We knew each other pretty well, so that by the time that we didn't, of course, know that President Bush was going to be elected, but when he was, we had a pretty clear idea of what we were going to do, and then, of course, when the administration came in, we brought our plans before the various players. The economic policy group, which Jimmy had started, still was in operation, and we brought the plans to that. But it was a little different in our case. We all knew each other. There weren't any strange faces.
Were you all in agreement on this plan?
I would say more or less in savings and loan bailout and the third world debt plan that became known as the Brady Plan, because we vetted it pretty carefully with the people who were there, and then as soon as the new players came into the administration, we took it by them, and they had a good chance to comment on it. It was changed in certain respects, not in all respects. It worked pretty well. That's different than the budget agreement of 1990, where there was a great deal of consternation, as you know, about whether, in order to achieve what I think is an enormous achievement by President Bush, which is to put Congress in irons so they couldn't spend money above that which was brought in, he made the decision, knowing full well, as I've said a number of times, that if it was put to him, as it was by George Mitchell and the people in the Democratic hierarchy, that he had to raise taxes in order to get the reforms across, he was taking a political risk which he was absolutely clear was going to cause him trouble in the next election. And I think it was, if you were writing a profile in courage, making that restrictive step on Congress to make sure they didn't spend more than they brought in, which carried forward under the Clinton administration is a significant piece of American history, which this president knew full well what he was getting into. He didn't like it. He told me once, Brady, the trouble with you is you never ran for sheriff. But he was very clear about how it was going to turn out for him in terms of campaign difficulty later on.
Talked about Lloyd Benson having served in the House and the Senate. He's also a county judge. He ran for a lot of offices here. Let's talk about politics. We've talked about a little bit of it, but when I say politics, it could be a profile in courage, but we live in the real world. People want to get reelected. The parties want their people to be elected. And how does that discussion go when someone at the table says, well, this is the right thing to do economically, and someone else says, this is going to cost us votes? Now, Secretary Baker, you've had distinguished service in a number of posts, but you've also been a campaign manager for a number of candidates. So how does that work?
Well, I think the way it works is that you have to pay particular attention to promises made during a campaign for president. That doesn't mean that you can keep them all. It doesn't mean that you can't shave some of them in the interest of maintaining public support for your presidency. No president is going to be successful unless he can maintain the support of the American people for his policies. I'll tell you, nobody ever accused the Gipper of being squishy. But Ronald Reagan told me on any number of occasions, Jim, I'd much rather get 75 or 80% of what I want than to go over the cliff with my flag flying. And Don Regan has heard the same thing because he's been in there in the Oval as chief of staff with President Reagan. So sometimes you have to accommodate in order to maintain your political strength and
Can you give us an example?
Your political power.
Can you give me an example that you
Well,
care to?
Yeah, I think so. One example is the one you brought up. President Reagan did not want to raise taxes in 1982, even though in the 80 campaign we campaigned on a platform of cutting taxes by $500 billion. But we cut taxes by $750 billion.
But he also said that he wanted to balance the budget. I remember him saying it.
Well, that's right, but he didn't have he had a Democratic Congress that wasn't going to cooperate with him very much. I know you don't want to get
I said I didn't want to get into
you
politics.
say you don't want to get into political. You don't want to get into a political argument here. But the real political difference on this panel, I think all of us would agree on the responsibilities and duties of the Secretary of the Treasury. We will have some policy differences in the second panel, I'm quite sure, when Paul comes up here. But the fundamental difference, as I see it, between us is, and this may be something to talk about later, is what is responsible for this growth that we've had over the past really 18 years with a timeout of maybe 16 months in 90 and 91 for a recession that was, I think, tied in some part to the Gulf War. What's been responsible for that? Mike Blumenthal and Bill Miller have told you, you had pointed it out yourself, what the situation was in 1980. The misery index was 20%, the combination of unemployment and inflation. Ronald Reagan inherited a really bad economy, and he came forward with some really fundamental changes, reducing the top marginal tax rate from 70% down to 28%.
I think I said you were a campaign man. Here's a campaign speech.
No, I'm
here.
not campaigning. I'm not campaigning. But I wanted, because Bob Rubin is going to tell us that, and to some extent this is true, fiscal discipline is really important. It is important. But let me just tell you something. These deficits that you were condemning here a minute ago, I was
pointing them out.
We enjoyed 7.5 years, 7 3/4 years of unprecedented growth with these huge deficits. We were creating jobs and economic growth continued. When President Clinton took office, he inherited a pretty darn good economy. Took office from President Bush, and he kept it going, did a good job, but fiscal discipline is not the only answer.
I'm not taking sides in this, Secretary Baker, but I would... Paul Gigot is better qualified than I am to get into policy. I want to now come to you, right to reply, but I also want you to extend it to when the Republicans took over the Congress in 1994. Talk to me about how politics may have entered in your dealings with those chairman as well as within your administration.
I would be delighted to say, and let me just very briefly say, Jim, I think we have probably would have a slightly different view as to how the remarkable economic conditions from 1993 to year 2000 occurred, but we inherited an economy with about 7.25% unemployment, with very little private job creation. I was running Goldman Sachs at the time. I think there was a general view here and abroad that our economy was in a morass and was likely to be so for a long, long time. And I do think the restoration of fiscal discipline was absolutely central to what happened going forward in many different respects. Now, having said that, let me respond to the question.
I think I've lost control, but
no,
do
no,
I look
Sam.
like Jim Lair?
No, you.
Sam?
Descriptively, wait a minute.
Yeah.
Descriptively.
Yes, sir.
Descriptively. The economy was expanding and had been for some 9 months when you took office.
George,
it was not declining.
No,
it
no,
was expanding.
That's
just a descriptive statement.
Yes,
that's all.
I agree there was an upward blip. but I will also tell you, because I was enormously involved that time in trying to figure out what we were going to do with our firm and where we were going to emphasize growth and so forth, that the general view was that we were in quite a serious morass, and there was a general view that American economic prospects were likely to be mediocre for a long time to come, both here and abroad.
Well, tell us about the politics of Goldman Sachs.
Sam,
But no,
Sam.
but
Sam, could I just interject?
Goldman Sachs could be wrong.
Paul, I didn't do this on purpose.
1994 was obviously a stunning event if you were sitting in the White House, which I was at the time. I think the general answer to your question, Sam, and by the way, right after 1994, I can remember the first few weeks when we in the White House people were milling about and trying to figure out what was happening. There were enormous differences of opinion as to what politically had caused this, and there were some people who felt that the administration needed to be more populist. That was not my view. There were some people who felt that we had been too populist. There were others who felt, I was one of them, that healthcare had perhaps I think there was a lot in the healthcare program actually that made a lot of sense, but that the healthcare program had conveyed a sense of big government, perhaps even a touch of reality to that about the program, and that had played a big role. Whatever the realities were, Sam, there was a real rethinking of how to position the president politically. But what was interesting to me, at least, given the role that I had at that time, was that economically we basically stayed on the same track as we had all through the 8 years. And I think it's because we had a president who had a very deeply held view, right or wrong, I happen to think right, of what he needed to do.
But what's the politics of dealing with the Republican Congress when they took over the Congress? Don't you have to make trades? Don't you have to go up there and talk to the chairman of the Senate
Yeah,
Finance
but you know what the
Committee?
first thing that happened when we got our feet are back on the ground? They put out you may remember this, they put out a budget that had enormous decreases in Medicare. I'm not arguing about Medicare one way or the other, but there were enormous decreases in Medicare and there were enormous tax cuts. And one of the people in the White House, George Stephanopoulos, you're not unfamiliar with, figured out the two about matched in dollars. And that gave us a theme. And it really did enable the president to reestablish his place in the at least in my judgment, to reestablish his feet politically. And from that point forward, things worked pretty well through '96 when he obviously did very well in the campaign.
Secretary Schultz, I'm going to pose a question, but I know you'll say whatever you want to say, which is just fine with me. My question is, going back to the wage and price controls, that was done because of a need to get reelected and a feeling that that would be the way to help do it. Am I wrong?
I think you're probably wrong.
Oh, okay.
Although it helped.
Even though you disagreed with it?
I disagreed violently with it.
Then why else would they do it?
The argument was that we were forced to close the gold window, that is, give up the stated relationship of the dollar to gold.
$35.
That had to take place for all kinds of reasons we don't need to go into. And clearly the dollar would weaken when that happened. And that was inflationary. We had been fighting, I believed, a very successful battle against the inflation that the administration had inherited, and it was gradually coming under control. In fact, I had given in my balmier days as director of the budget a speech entitled "Steady as You Go," advocating we're on policy, stick with it, it's going to work, it's working. And but there was a tremendous amount of pressure, and I'll never forget a business council meeting when the businessmen and financiers all voted for wage and price controls. It was stunning. They all thought you could have wage controls without price controls. The naivety of it was just bowled me over. But anyway, there was all of that taking place.
May I point out, when you put them in, you brought a Texan up to run it.
Well, he was the guy who created this, and the argument was that the closing of the gold window and the weakening of the dollar would be inflationary, which it would, but I would argue that we didn't need to do that at that time. But I'd like to make a comment on this question you posed about the Treasury and politics and economics.
Please.
Because it seems to me, obviously, the White House is very political. It's the political center of our country. And the president has to judge things in their overall merits. But I think the Secretary of the Treasury has a responsibility to be primarily sort of the guardian of what the realities are and what a sort of semi-professional view of matters is, and argue for that. And so you don't win all the time. And you have to accommodate yourself, but a non-political view of where we're going needs to be presented. And I think it's the job of the Treasury Secretary to be sure that it is presented.
Politics, Secretary Reagan?
One of the things that we've left out here so far is the Congress of the United States and politics, and what can the administration do, and what can the Secretary of the Treasury do about it. Particularly, we'll talk about the tax field. You have to think in terms of where taxes originate in the Ways and Means Committee. You have to think in terms of the fact that the Congress wants to have its own head in this area. And while the administration can propose many good things in the area, and currently the administration is proposing a lot of good things, watch what happens over the next several weeks when the Congress gets this into its lap and starts debating it itself. And everybody in the Congress has his or her own view of what should be done in the tax field. I can remember the 1981 tax cuts. We spent enormous amounts of time with various members of the Ways and Means Committee, trading really back and forth with them. Well, you want that in the budget? Well, we want this in taxes. And you have to go through it. As a guy who spent a lot of time in Philadelphia, I have to tell you, never look at how they make scrapple. And secondly, never look at how they make a tax bill. It is not a pleasant sight. It might turn out all right, depending upon whether they've cut taxes, which I would prefer, or raised taxes, as someone else might prefer. And, but nevertheless, you've got to remember that the Secretary of the Treasury is limited in what he can do in the tax field by the whims of the Congress.
Talk to me about
Sam,
politics.
I have a suggestion for you about a question you might ask.
This question.
I never disregard your suggestions, Secretary Schultz, no matter what post you hold.
I think one of the most interesting case studies in, you might say, economics and politics was the 1986 Tax Act, which was a mammoth event that I think had a lot to do with the prosperity that followed it. Don Regan was the secretary when that got going, and Jim Baker was the secretary when that finally got put together under President Reagan's leadership. But it was very bipartisan. Bill Bradley had the laboring arm, I think, in the Senate. Al Gore voted for it. It was a thoroughly bipartisan bill. And so it was big, it was important, it was bipartisan, and how in the world did these two secretaries of the Treasury bring that off?
Well, we did it with Democratic votes, I must say. And as you point out, it was quite bipartisan. But in reducing that top marginal rate from the 50% that it had been down to 28 in that 86 tax reform, we were taking on a lot of our own party's constituencies. But President Reagan knew how important it was to accomplish this legislation, and he was willing to make those difficult political choices and decisions. But it was a good example, George, as you point out, of true bipartisanship in the enactment of important economic policy. First time in 100 years, I think, that there'd been any real fundamental tax reform.
I want to get two more comments, and then I want to throw the operation over to the audience for the real question. Secretary Blumenthal, what about politics? When you sat there, did you say, well, this is the right economic plan, but I don't think that is going to set well with the public, cost us votes?
Well, as I've listened to the discussion, it occurs to me that there are two things more to be said about it. I agree with George Shultz that, of course, it is the function of the Secretary of the Treasury to tell the President as he sees it and to try to tell him the facts, even if he knows that the politics may be difficult for the President. It's his job to do that. However, that does not mean that the Secretary of the Treasury should not understand what politics is all about and should not be able to deal in a highly political environment. He does so vis-a-vis the Congress all the time. That is a horse trading operation. If you've ever sat before a congressional committee or been in the private offices of members of Congress in the House and Senate, you are negotiating all the time. You have a certain goal that you're trying to reach on behalf of the President, the administration. But you are horse trading, you're dealing, you're part of the political system, even though you have not run for sheriff or for any other office. That's one thing. The second thing comes back to how the White House is organized. If the White House is organized by the President in a way so that his political advisors are people who have experience, prior experience in Washington, who know how the system works, who understand what the role of the Secretary of the Treasury is and who can factor all of that in. He's got one kind of problem. If the White House is organized with political advisors who've helped them get elected, but who have no experience in Washington, and who look at things not from the point of view of a Secretary of the Treasury, but almost entirely from the point of view of how does it play out in the field and how will it look in the polls the next week or the next month. He's got another kind of problem. So the role of the Secretary of the Treasury is also a very political role, and you can never forget it.
Secretary Miller, I want your view on this. And I want to note, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, that when you left the Fed to take the Treasury post, Paul Volcker was appointed.
That's correct.
And immediately began a policy, a traditional policy, to wring out inflation, which drove up the unemployment rate, drove up interest rates. Is that good politics to elect Jimmy Carter for a second term?
I recommended Paul Volcker because under the circumstances it was important to have a responsible monetary policy, and under the circumstances I certainly agreed with that program and started it myself. Let's go back to your politics question in another sense, though. I agree with George Shultz that President Nixon made I think, a bad decision in putting in wage and price controls. He also put in another price control that I think was a mistake, and that was to put in a control, a cap on oil prices when the '73 oil price shock came. And that created a democratic problem
of an entitlement system so that imported oil at one price and domestic oil at another price had to be rationalized. It created an enormous bureaucracy. And in Japan, when the same shock came, they had no indigenous oil. So they accepted a 20% inflation rate for 1 year. They adjusted and got rid of it. We kept burying this there and didn't admit it had happened. We kept denying that it happened. So we had a long tail. In our administration, and I think we would all agree at this table, that getting rid of these kind of controls and letting the market system work is probably the best thing for us. I don't think George Shultz probably would support that price cap on oil, but I don't know. But in any case,
it's all part
our
of the
objective...
same thing. But Bill, people never learn.
I know.
Here we are in California, or you're
Exactly.
in Texas, but in California, we have price
Same thing.
controls, and it has been ruinous
Doesn't
on
work.
electricity. Absolutely ruinous.
Absolutely right. So we wanted to get rid of that problem. Now, politics. To get rid of oil control, which Jimmy Carter did by signing an executive order, we had to deal with the Congress, said, we'll trump you because we're not going to let this happen. So we had to, Charles Duncan, who was Secretary of Energy and as chairman of Rice, was the secretary, and he and I had to put through a very bad legislation because of politics. It was called a windfall profits tax. And the only merit of it, it disappeared in 3 years. But that was the trade-off, and the answer is, what is the higher good? The higher good is to get back a market system. You'd realize that 2 years, 3 years later, oil was at $10 a barrel instead of 30. The market system worked. So, but think what we had to pay to get it.
Gentlemen, thank you. I want to now turn this over to the audience. I believe there are microphones. Am I correct, Ambassador? However you pronounce it? Juridian?
Raise your hand and when recognized, wait until the student ambassador gives you the microphone.
I see a hand right back there. They're right behind you. Yes, ma'am. Direct your question to a specific secretary or to the panel?
To the panel in general, would you please discuss the fear on the part of the Secretary of the Treasury to use the R word?
Who wants to take the R word? Sir.
We're in a recession right now. We won't know about it for at least 2 quarters, because the technical definition of a recession is 2 down quarters. The second quarter of this year was an up quarter, 0.3% on the plus side. My guess is that the economy was teetering on September 10th, and I think on September 11th, it got a shove over the side. I think that the steps that have to be taken now is to figure that we are in a recession, and how do we get out of a recession? How do we make it more of a V rather than a U, or rather a W, as we inherited in the 80-81
But if you had been in office as Secretary of the Treasury at this moment, would you come forward and say, ladies and gentlemen, we're in a recession?
No.
Thank you. Anyone else? All right.
Sam, if I can just add,
Please,
I
Secretary
think
Brady.
that there's too much attention paid to the word recession. It's a technical definition that's invented by economists, 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth, and it's something that they have to record in their annals. But the question is whether you're in a slowdown or not and what effect that has. And I agree totally with Don Regan. We are in a serious slowdown, and I guess I would get in an argument with Bob on this, but it started very clearly in my mind in the summer of 2000. But where it started is not anywhere near as important as to where it's going to end. It's a serious matter, but the word recession is something that's a catchword. I don't think it's important. We are in an economic slowdown now, and it's a pretty healthy one.
Right of reply?
Very brief. I actually think our current economic situation prior to September 11th is a very complex subject. I think basically through 8 years of really remarkable economic conditions toward the end of that, I would agree with you, Nick. I think we developed some imbalances that I think the kinds of things inevitably happen during extended good periods, and therefore we were going to have a slowdown. The question of how much of a slowdown, I think, was a function in some measure of the imbalances we developed, and in some measure of that which was said and done by those who had to deal with it.
Question from the audience. Who has the microphone? Back there, there's one, or if you have one up here, that's fine.
In year 2000, when the prosperity was continuing, if Federal Reserve did not raise interest rate too high in year 2000, we may have seen soft landing instead of a weak economy. How would you say?
Who wants to say that Alan Greenspan raised interest rates too high in the year 2000?
So it's possible. So it's possible to look back and second guess, but it seems to me, by and on the large, you have to say the Fed policy has been extraordinary.
What does that word mean, sir?
It means that it was extraordinary in its restraint, in sensing that something different was happening to the economy, and the traditional calculations of how fast it could grow without breaking into inflation perhaps were questionable, and let it ride and test out the edge of the envelope. And I think that he was wise to do that. Right now, I might just put in a side thing. People are forever writing articles. I saw one even in the Wall Street Journal that says people question whether monetary policy works. Well, all of the history shows that it does. And the thing that people are complaining about, that Greenspan tightened and the economy showed it, is an example of it works.
Oh,
and it'll work on the other side as well.
All right.
You know, Sam, on monetary policy and interest rates, the Fed has to be concerned not only with the evidence of inflation, but the expectation of inflation. I think the Fed had to recognize that there was a activity in the economy that, if not curtail, could have incipient or could even change expectations about inflation and be damaging to the economy. And I think the Fed's effort to continue to let the economy grow so long as it wasn't unleashing unacceptable inflation was fine. And I think its willingness to put some restraint on it was a very good policy.
Well, Secretary Brady, the Fed worried about inflation in 1990 and 1991, and your man might have been reelected if it had.
Well, I think that's true, you know, and because you respect the independency of the Fed doesn't mean you can't disagree with them. But, and I do think that probably in 1992, the interest rates could have been conducted in a way so that they were lower and perhaps the economy would look a little better. But I would take this opportunity to go back and with all great admiration for the job that Bob Rubin did during his 8 years, I think you have to admit that in the fourth quarter of 1992, which was the last quarter of the Bush administration, the economy grew at 5.6%. So I don't think we handed you something that was so terrible.
I agree there was an upward blip, Nick, in what I would view as a morass.
That's a pretty big upward lift, 5.6%.
All right. Who has
Sam, let me
Yes,
just say
please.
one thing. I bet there's not a former Treasury Secretary on this panel that wouldn't tell you, if he was honest, that there were times.
What do you mean?
Where do you get that?
That there were times when he disagreed with the policy of the Federal Reserve. It just happens, I think, at least it certainly happened during my 4 years on more than one occasion, and I would be surprised if it didn't happen on the watch of all of these other Treasury Secretaries, because there's a healthy tension there between the Treasury Secretary, or the job of the Treasury, and the job of the Federal Reserve.
And you know,
By the way,
mostly that's bound to be true, but mostly Treasury Secretaries have recognized that even though they could disagree and hope otherwise, that the independence of the Fed happens to be a fundamental need and should be retained.
Absolutely.
And therefore, the threats to the independence have more often come from the politics in Congress than from the administration. I think the administration that I've known have all believed the independence of the Fed was a great
Well, it's not a
anchor.
question of independence, Bill. It's a question of whether you agree or disagree with their particular policy
That's right.
approach at that time. I don't think anybody disagrees that they ought to be independent.
I'd like to add a postscript here that we are the only nation in the world wherein the central bank does not report to the finance minister. It happens the Bank of Japan reports in, the Chancellor of the Exchequer is in charge of the Bank of England. Every other central bank reports to the finance minister.
Is this a good thing?
I think that is something that deserves the work of scholars. I'm not prepared to say at this particular moment as to whether it's a good thing or not, but I
think
do
ac-
think
actually-
this.
Moving in
Actually-
the other direction.
You've
the
got
Bank of England has been made independent. One of the most interesting experiments is in New Zealand, where the central bank has an explicit inflationary duty that it is held responsible for solely.
I agree with all of that, but you have to remember that now the Federal Reserve is becoming more and more political. I notice that the chairman of the Fed is advising the Congress these days. I think if he's going to remain independent, he should advise neither
Well, wait a
the
moment.
executive or
Just
the
a second.
legislative
I'm
branches.
I'm the first chairman to testify under the Humphrey Hawkins, and it wasn't the chairman advising the Congress, it was the Congress asking the chairman
Not in
to
the
come
back
and-
rooms. I'm talking about in the back rooms, Bill.
I was going to follow up on what Jim Baker said, and others have now pushed it further. It's not only important who's the president and who's the secretary of the Treasury, it's also important who's the chairman of the Fed. Let's not forget that. There are very strong, independent-minded chairmen of the Fed, and there are others that are more malleable, that are more political. You ask the question, is the chairman of the Fed really independent politically? Yes, in theory he is, more or less. but some are more independent than others.
Depending on
That's
how
very
near
important.
it comes
That has
time for reappointment, or what?
Oh, well, at any time, I think there are some differences in personality and in outlook. And that's why, while it is absolutely true, Jim, that probably all of us have had disagreements with the chairman, the question really is whether or not you have a chairman you work with whom you have breakfast twice a week, or however you deal with him, with whom you basically see eye to eye, or with whom you're always or almost always at loggerheads. I think one of the great things about the Clinton period seems to have been, watching it from the outside, that that Alan Greenspan and the Clinton administration policymakers, the president, were mainly on the same wavelength in terms of trying to get the budget into shape. And that, I think, has been very, very important. That's, I think, a very fortuitous and a very good development. It hasn't always been that way. And so I think, like everything else, it's a matter of degree.
Does the chairman of the Fed read the election returns, as Mr. Dooley says the Supreme Court does?
Of course he does. Of course he does.
I mean, so a chairman could, at one point, be advising that we shouldn't have a large tax cut, and then a few months later say that we could, in fact, accommodate a large tax cut?
I worked with Arthur Burns, and he became a good friend, and he's no longer here to defend himself. But let me tell you, Arthur was a political animal. Absolutely, absolutely. And you found that out in the first 3 months when you worked with him. He was a distinguished professor of economics, and I was much younger than he was, and I was in awe of him because I'd read his textbooks. But it took me a few months to figure out that he was like the rest of the people in Washington.
Oh, please. Oh, wow. Let's have another question from the audience. Do we have a microphone back there? Where is the microphone?
Right here, left.
Oh, up here. I can't see because of the light, so I'm sorry if I'm playing favorites here. Go ahead.
One of the functions that not much has been said about that would be very interesting to hear about is the whole area of foreign trade, balances trade, the strength of the dollar, because it seems to me that at least 3 or 4 of you have to play a very big role in that. And if you might also combine that with some remarks, we've talked about the tension between White House politics and the treasuryship. I'd be interested in hearing any comments about the tensions between State Department, that is, foreign trade as an element of foreign policy.
Gentlemen, concentrate more on the tensions, because Paul Gigot is going to get into the policy aspects of your question, which is a very good one. But just who wants to start out there? Or here?
Sam, the first thing I think you have to know about trade is that it's spread all over all of the departments at Washington. Treasury has a piece of it. State Department has a piece of it. Of course, you have the U.S. Trade Representative, the Commerce Department. So it's a very hard thing to...
Labor.
Excuse me?
Labor.
Labor as well. And it's a very hard... Nobody really has the clear lead on it. The USTR is supposed to. USTR was created because in an attempt to try and make sure that somebody took a lead on it, but it's very hard for the USTR person to get a policy agreed to, because it's in so many different places and so many different people have the bureaucratic right to comment on it. So it's a very hard thing to get done. One of the remarkable things was NAFTA, which Jim, I would say, in the Bush administration took the lead on, beat it through the administration, and then, started it through Congress, and the Clinton administration, in its wisdom, kept it going. But it's something that's all over the place inside the government. There is no clear place where they can make a decision like State, Treasury, or Defense.
Well, of course, yes.
Yeah, if you want to take another piece of the international economic agenda, and I think it makes the point about tension very well. You take crisis response, for example, in 1997, 1998 in Asia. Clearly, there were geopolitical concerns, there were domestic political concerns, there were domestic economic concerns, there were international economic concerns, and as Sam indicated, there could be very different views in various of the agencies. There were certainly people at the State Department, people in the White House, and people at Treasury who had quite different views, and the administration had to find some way to make decisions. And moreover, it's done in the context of very rapidly moving markets that are enormously affected by what you're doing and that don't wait for orderly policy processes. So it's in that context you have to find some way, some process for dealing with these things, and if you don't deal with them effectively, you run very serious risks, not only globally, well, globally and also with respect to our own economy. We had a way of dealing with that, and others might have dealt with it differently.
Well, all right, let us end the panel now because we're running short of time, and I want to thank our distinguished panel here. The other one's coming up shortly. May I just have a final word about you reminded me about the R word, recession. I was reading on Warren Buffett's website yesterday. Mr. Buffett said that he believes we're going to have a very deep and probably prolonged recession. But he said we are prepared for it and we can get through it. And I thought to myself, maybe you can, Warren, but what about the rest of us? Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.